Have you ever walked through your neighborhood and suddenly realized that, that favorite corner store or maybe an old local restaurant is just gone, replaced by something sleek and new, maybe even feels a little out of place?
Yeah, or driven through a part of town you thought you knew, and bang, there are these massive apartment buildings going up where older homes used to be.
Exactly. It's like cities themselves are living things, constantly shifting. And these changes, especially when they happen fast, they can feel pretty dramatic.
They absolutely can. And these rapid transformations, they often make us stop and ask some pretty fundamental questions like, who is a city really built for?
Yeah,
And who actually benefits from all this growth?
you got it. What we're witnessing is a deeply complex process, huge human impact.
Definitely.
And today we are taking a deep dive into that very complex phenomenon, gentrification. But we're also going to connect it to a powerful and maybe lesser known idea called the right to the city.
Right. Our mission today really is to unpack what gentrification truly is, explore its multifaceted impacts, and try to understand how different perspectives, sometimes really conflicting ones, and powerful ideas like the right to the city can maybe offer pathways to more equitable urban development.
We want to make sure you get a quick but, thorough understanding of this really critical urban issue.
Absolutely.
So to help us navigate this, we've drawn from some fascinating sources. We've got an in-depth academic article from the IIArt International Journal of Geography and Environmental Management.
Mm-hmm.
We've also got a really thought-provoking piece on ethical moving practices from EcoB&B.
Oh, interesting.
And for some raw, real-world insights, we're tapping into a public discussion thread from Reddit's True Unpopular Opinion about the pros and cons of gentrification.
Okay, that should be lively.
Definitely. So let's jump right in and unpack this.
Let's do it.
Okay, let's start with the basics then. What exactly is gentrification? Our sources, they define it as a process of urban district alteration. Basically, wealthier residents move in, and this often leads to the displacement of long-standing lower-income residents.
That's a crucial starting point. The IIRD article really emphasizes that it's not just about new buildings popping up. It leads to social ostracization, deepening housing inequality, spiking housing costs.
Wow.
Yeah, and the deterioration of a neighborhood's unique cultural character. And importantly, while it's often framed as regeneration or urban improvement, the benefits are rarely, if ever, equitably distributed.
Rarely, if ever, equitably distributed. That's a really powerful statement because I think a lot of people hear urban improvement and think, well, that sounds good for everyone. Can you maybe give us a quick concrete example? Like, how does that unequal distribution actually play out? What does it look like on the ground?
Sure. Okay, so imagine a longtime resident, maybe a senior, living on a fixed income. As the neighborhood gentrifies, their property taxes might suddenly shoot up. Or maybe their rent becomes unaffordable because the landlord sees an opportunity to attract new, wealthier tenants.
Right.
And then suddenly, the very services they rely on, the affordable grocery store, the local laundromat, they get replaced by fancy boutiques or expensive coffee shops they just can't afford. So while the neighborhood might look nicer to newcomers, it actually becomes a financial trap for those who've always lived there.
I see. And what's interesting is how this process even got its name. The term gentrification, it was actually coined in London back in the 1960s.
Yeah, by a British sociologist, Ruth Glass.
Right, Ruth Glass. She used it to describe how working-class residents were being pushed out by middle-class newcomers. And since then, wow, it's become a truly global urban trend.
Indeed. And it typically unfolds in a kind of discernible pattern. First, you often see what some people call the urban pioneers. These are usually middle-class or maybe affluent newcomers looking for cheaper alternatives to the really expensive parts of a city. They discover and settle into areas with lower rents or property values, often in historically working class or minority communities. They might be drawn by the character or maybe just the lower cost.
So after these urban pioneers arrive, that's when you start noticing those subtle shifts, almost imperceptible at first, right?
Exactly.
Like the corner store might suddenly stock artisanal cheeses, or that old familiar diner gets replaced by a high-end coffee shop, all minimalist design.
Precisely. It's like the neighborhood itself starts changing its clothes, catering to these new tastes. And this leads right into the next phase, the investor influx. Once a district gets this perceived glitz and becomes labeled as up and coming.
Yeah, you hear that phrase all the time.
Right. It attracts wealthier individuals, property developers, speculators, real estate agents. They see the profit potential and start aggressively marketing the district, really exploiting its newfound appeal.
And that, of course, means a surge of wealthier residents moving in, which just pushes property values and rents even higher.
Exactly.
So with all these changes happening, the big question really is, what does this mean for the families, the individuals who've called this neighborhood home for, like, decades?
Yeah, and that's where you see the really heartbreaking reality of displacement start to unfold. Long-standing residents, often from lower income backgrounds, they face this increasing financial pressure. Maybe older tenants get forced out because rents go up too much, or longtime homeowners might sell sometimes because they just can't afford the rising property taxes anymore.
Right.
And the ultimate outcome is that the neighborhood's original population often gets pushed out, replaced by more affluent newcomers. This dramatically reshapes the cultural fabric, sometimes to the point where the neighborhood becomes, as the article puts it, almost obscure or unrecognizable to those who lived there before it all started. It's truly an uprooting. Some sources call it deracination, which is a strong word, but it captures that sense of being pulled up by the roots.
It's clear this isn't just some natural evolution then. There are powerful forces, driving this change.
Yeah.
What are some of the key factors? What actually facilitates gentrification?
Well, the primary economic driver is undoubtedly profiteering. You've got property developers, investors, real estate speculators. They target urban areas with low property values, buy properties cheaply, maybe remodel or redevelop them, and then sell or rent them at much, much higher prices. This whole real estate speculation game is really about maximizing returns by attracting those wealthier residents.
And governments play a crucial role too, right? Our sources highlight how government policies, think like tax breaks for developers, zoning changes, infrastructure improvements, they can make these previously maybe unwanted neighborhoods suddenly look really attractive to investors.
That's spot on. These policies are often framed as urban regeneration or economic development, but they can have massive ripple effects.
Like investing in a new transit line or a park, things that seem good on the surface.
Exactly. Things that seem beneficial, but they inadvertently make the area much more desirable for a completely different demographic, driving up costs.
Okay.
Social and cultural shifts also play a part. There's definitely a growing quest for urban living, you could call it, a cultural pull towards city life, drawing people who want to be close to work, entertainment, cultural institutions.
It's often said that artists are kind of the first wave into these areas because the rents are lower.
Yeah.
Is there a connection there? Do creative industries inadvertently become an engine for this?
Absolutely. It's a very common pattern. Artists are often initially drawn to these low-cost areas, right? They need affordable studio space, affordable housing, maybe in neglected industrial zones.
Makes sense.
But their presence, however unintentional, can make a neighborhood seem edgy or chic. It creates this cultural buzz that then, ironically, entices investors and starts driving up property values.
Ah, the irony. So they help make it desirable and then get priced out themselves.
It's a bittersweet cycle for many artists, yeah.
And political decisions are key too. Things like big urban regeneration projects, infrastructure investments, changes in zoning rules. These can overtly favor wealthier newcomers and really accelerate displacement.
Yeah, governments might push for redevelopment of neglected areas as part of, economic growth strategies, but without enough thought for the existing residents.
Okay. And what about public housing? How does that fit in?
That's another important piece. The way public housing is managed can significantly advance gentrification. In some cases, governments might sell off or renovate public housing located in desirable urban areas. And they replace those affordable options with luxury developments. This directly displaces poorer residents who simply have nowhere else affordable to go in that area.
Okay, so we've talked about what gentrification is, what drives it. Now let's really focus on the human cost. What are the concrete impacts on the people, on the communities involved?
Well, displacement is arguably the most direct and damaging consequence, and we see both direct and indirect forms.
Okay, what's the difference?
Direct displacement is pretty clear-cut. It's when tenants are explicitly evicted, maybe because of sudden massive rent hikes, or when properties are sold outright to developers who want the building empty.
Got it.
Indirect displacement is a bit more subtle. It happens when longtime residents leave kind of voluntarily, but really because they just can't keep up anymore. The rising cost of living, the changing character of the neighborhood, they feel squeezed out, even if they aren't formally evicted.
And the impact isn't felt equally, is it? Our sources stress that vulnerable groups, people of color, senior citizens, low-income families, they're overwhelmingly affected.
Absolutely disproportionately. You look at cities like San Francisco, New York, Historically, Black, Latino immigrant communities have faced extensive uprooting as more affluent, often white residents move in.
And that leads to the breakdown of communities, right? These tight-knit social networks just get eroded.
Exactly. It's heartbreaking. You lose social support systems, cultural identity. It's a deep fragmentation.
Another major impact you mentioned is the rising cost of living and this widening inequality.
Yeah. As wealthier people move in, everything goes up. Property values, rents, property taxes, even the price of groceries or getting your laundry done. It just becomes financially unsustainable for many longtime residents to stay.
It sounds like a real economic squeeze, as one source put it.
It really is. And think about the local businesses. Those long-standing, locally owned shops, the ones that traditionally served working-class residents, they often get forced out too. Rents skyrocket, property taxes go up.
And they're replaced by high-priced places catering to the newcomers.
Exactly. Upscale boutiques, expensive cafes, which further alienates the existing community. So you see this exacerbation of socioeconomic inequalities. Wealth and opportunity get concentrated among the new residents, while any infrastructure improvements often come way too late for the people who've already been displaced.
And finally, there's this profound loss of cultural identity.
Yes. Gentrification often deteriorates that unique cultural character of a neighborhood, especially those shaped by minority communities for generations. Traditions, businesses, the social fabric, the very things that define the community, they can just disappear.
There's a really poignant example in the source material from Chicago's Pilsen neighborhood.
Right, a historically vibrant Mexican-American area. Gentrification there has led to the relocation of many Latino families, directly threatening that cultural identity.
The influx of new, wealthier residents brings different kinds of services, different demands, and it changes the neighborhood's identity, sometimes, as you said, to the point where it's almost unrecognizable to the people who built it.
It's a profound loss.
Given these really significant impacts, it's clear that we need something more than just passively observing this process. And this is where that concept, the right to the city, comes in. It offers a powerful counter-narrative.
It really does. This concept, it was actually coined by the French sociologist Henri Lefebvre way back in 1968. And at its core, the right to the city basically says that urban areas aren't just physical locations, they're social constructs shaped by the people who live and work in them. And it argues that all residents, especially marginalized groups, have a fundamental right to access, use, and crucially shape their urban spaces.
So it's a direct challenge to the idea of cities as just commodities, right, or assets for the highest bidder. It runs totally counter to that commercialization of urban space driven purely by market forces.
Exactly. It's saying, essentially, that the city should belong to its people, not just be an instrument for profit.
Okay.
It positions the right to the city as a more democratic, more participatory way to approach urban development. It empowers ordinary citizens to have a say in shaping their environments, rather than leaving it solely to the interests of developers and external investors.
It emphasizes this right to appropriate urban space. What does that mean exactly?
It includes things like ensuring cost-effective housing, guaranteeing access to public spaces for everyone, and actively protecting community identity and culture.
So, connecting this to the bigger picture, it's about reclaiming space for those who are often pushed to the margins. It's about challenging those exclusionary dynamics of gentrification and saying, hey, residents should have a real say in their city's future.
Precisely. It's a framework for empowerment.
So, if the right to the city is this powerful idea, what can actually be done on the ground? Like, what kinds of policy solutions and community actions can help prevent or at least lessen the negative effects of gentrification?
Well, a critical approach is definitely developing and conserving affordable housing. Since spiking rents and property prices are major drivers of displacement, policies that protect sustainable housing options can provide much-needed stability for long-term residents.
Okay, so things like inclusionary zoning. I think I've heard of that. Where developers have to set aside a certain percentage of new units as affordable.
Exactly. Rather than just building luxury condos, they have to include housing for existing residents too. New York and San Francisco have implemented versions of this. Another tool is rent control or rent stabilization, which basically put caps on how much rents can increase each year. This helps keep housing affordable for long-term tenants. Now, you have to design these policies carefully so they don't completely discourage new development, but they can be effective.
Okay.
Cities can also set up specific, accessible housing trust funds. These are pools of money, maybe financed by developer fees or property taxes or grants, specifically dedicated to creating and preserving affordable units.
And what about community land trusts, CLTs? They seem to be getting more attention.
Yes, CLTs are really interesting. They're nonprofit organizations that acquire land on behalf of a community. The key thing is they take the land out of the speculative market.
Huh?
So they ensure long-term affordability by separating the ownership of the land from the ownership of the housing on it. Places like Burlington, Vermont, and Oakland, California have used CLTs quite successfully to keep housing accessible.
So beyond housing itself, what about protecting tenants? Anti-displacement measures?
Absolutely crucial. Things like just cause eviction laws. These protect tenants from being evicted without a legitimate reason, like not paying rent or damaging property. It prevents landlords from just kicking people out to raise rents for wealthier tenants. San Francisco and Seattle have laws like this.
Okay. And I saw mention of right to return policies.
Yeah, that's another important one. This ensures that residents who are displaced by redevelopment have the chance to return to their neighborhood once the project is done, often with financial help and guaranteed affordable rents.
That seems fair.
And empowering tenants themselves is vital. Supporting tenant organizing efforts, providing access to legal assistance. These things help residents understand their rights and collectively push back against displacement pressures.
What about those community benefits agreements, CBAs? How do they work?
CBAs are basically legal contracts negotiated between developers and community groups. They ensure that a specific development project provides tangible benefits back to the community.
Like what kind of benefits?
Could be things like including a certain amount of affordable housing in the project, implementing local hiring strategies so residents get jobs, or investing in nearby parks or public amenities. Los Angeles and Detroit have used CBAs effectively.
And finally, collaborative planning and zoning, making sure the community has a real voice.
Exactly. This means genuinely involving local communities in decisions about urban development. Things like participatory planning, where residents help decide how public funds are spent, or participatory budgeting.
Giving people actual power over what gets built in their own neighborhoods.
Right. And zoning reform is key too. Amending zoning laws to prevent purely speculative development and instead prioritize affordable housing or community-serving uses. Making sure new construction actually aligns with what the community needs, not just what brings the highest profit.
This raises a really important question. What about the people on the ground? When communities decide to fight back against gentrification, what does that grassroots resistance actually look like?
Well, grassroots resistance is really rooted in powerful community organizing and mobilization. You see local organizations, neighborhood alliances, tenant groups. They work tirelessly to raise awareness about what's happening.
Okay.
They coordinate protests, they advocate for policies that prioritize their needs, really trying to create a unified front against development projects that threaten to displace longtime residents.
I can imagine that gives people a real collective voice, something they might not have individually.
Absolutely. And often, these local groups form larger pressure groups or coalitions. They might team up with other support groups, labor unions, civil rights organizations.
To amplify their concerns, make it harder to ignore them.
Exactly. Make it harder for developers and policymakers to just brush them aside. We've seen powerful coalitions like this in cities like San Francisco and New York, really pushing back against massive development plans that favor luxury housing. Their advocacy often centers on demanding stronger affordable housing policies, pushing for rent control, supporting those community land trusts we talked about.
And it's not just about policy, right?
Yeah.
There's a strong focus on cultural preservation, too.
Definitely. Since gentrification can often feel like it's erasing a neighborhood's unique character, grassroots resistance actively works to conserve it. This might be through supporting local art, music, food traditions, celebrating what makes the neighborhood special. It's about resisting that cultural homogenization that gentrification can bring.
Keeping the soul of the place alive.
Precisely. And sometimes this resistance takes the form of direct action. Protests.
Like picketing sit-ins.
Yeah, picketing, sit-ins, sometimes even occupations of development sites. These strategies are used to physically halt or delay projects, but also, crucially, to gain media attention and put pressure on decision makers.
Is there an example of that working?
Yeah, the sources mention protesters in Berlin who actually occupied buildings scheduled for luxury redevelopment. Their actions generated so much public support and political pressure that it forced the government to seriously revisit its housing framework.
Wow. So this really isn't just about economic changes. It's fundamentally about people fighting for their place, their history, and their cultural identity.
Exactly. It's deeply personal.
This deep dive into gentrification It's clearly not just about economics or social processes.
Mm.
Our sources suggest it carries this really profound ethical weight. The IIRD article in particular introduces some really thought-provoking concepts that challenge how we even view this whole process.
Yeah, what's fascinating there is how they reframe gentrification, not just as an economic procedure, but as an organized breach of the right to the city.
An organized breach. That's strong language.
It is, and that perspective fundamentally emphasizes human needs over what they call plutocratic interests, basically the interests of the super wealthy and powerful.
One powerful question this whole thing raises is, who owns the city?
Right.
Gentrification often seems to operate on the assumption that urban space is just an asset, a commodity for the highest bidder.
But the idea of the right to the city completely flips that. It asserts that urban spaces should be shaped collectively by their inhabitants, so it forces us to ask, should cities really belong to those with the most financial leverage, or should they belong to the communities who've historically lived there, worked there, created the culture there?
It's a fundamental question.
Another really compelling idea the sources bring up is viewing gentrification as a form of urban colonialism.
Wow, okay. Explain that one.
It's not just meant as a strong metaphor. It fundamentally reframes how we see the process. It suggests that affluent newcomers, much like colonial powers in history, can inadvertently displace and even erase the existing culture and presence of long-time, often marginalized residents.
So transforming a neighborhood not through organic growth, but through a kind of quiet cultural conquest.
Kind of, yeah. It forces us to ask, is this really urban renewal, or is it a subtle form of domination? It's a challenging perspective.
And this leads to an even bigger idea, maybe, the concept of urban space as a human right.
Right. If urban spaces are increasingly controlled by real estate developers, by speculative investors turning districts into global commodities, can we actually reconceive the city as a place where fundamental rights like housing and community are prioritized over the relentless pursuit of profit?
And if we do see urban space as a human right, then displacement caused by gentrification becomes, well, the article calls it an ethical bankruptcy.
That's a critical point. It really shifts the moral landscape. And it brings us neatly to the right to stay put.
The right to stay put. I like the sound of that.
It's a powerful idea. It's the notion that communities have the right to remain in their places of origin, their homes, without being involuntarily relocated by economic forces they can't control. It reframes the fight against gentrification not just as an economic struggle, but as a defense of community integrity, of culture, of deep social connections. It's about defending the right to belong where you are. And finally, there's this concept of the city as a cistern of resistance.
A cistern, like holding water.
Yeah, holding resistance. Instead of seeing cities merely as sites of economic progress, convenience, consumption, this perspective reframes them as sites of resistance against unchecked commercial expansion. Grassroots movements defying gentrification aren't just reactions. They represent a reclaiming of space and a demand for democratic control over how our cities evolve.
So in this view, the right to the city becomes almost like a call to arms, a call for defiance against that dominant economic logic that just reduces everything to financial negotiation.
Exactly. It advocates instead for cities that are molded by collective shared decision-making. Cities for people, not just for profit.
Okay, so far we focused quite a bit on the critical perspective of gentrification, the negative impacts. But like any complex issue, there are multiple viewpoints, and some people argue there are actually real advantages. Our Reddit source, True Unpopular Opinion, gives us a peek into these perceived benefits, and they're pretty candid.
Yeah, that thread was interesting. For instance, one user on Reddit suggested that gentrification is, and I quote, pretty much necessary to preserve crumbling historic buildings. The argument being that new investment is needed to stop decay and fund preservation efforts.
Okay, I can see that argument. Another perspective highlighted potential economic benefits, though they acknowledged the tension. One person said it's a tough situation. On one hand, there are economic benefits to people coming to a poorer community. On the other hand, locals can get priced out.
Right, and there was a user who identified as being from Bushwick in Brooklyn. They mentioned their own rent went up significantly, which wasn't great.
Yeah.
But they also noted that crime noticeably went down, nice shops and grocery stores opened up, and they talked about an elderly neighbor who'd bought a house for next to nothing back in the early 90s and was now, quote, quite pleased that he was now sitting on a multi-million-dollar property. So some longtime homeowners do benefit financially.
That's a really important point. And there's also the argument about the city's finances, that a higher tax base from increased property values could potentially keep property tax rates from rising for other residents elsewhere in the city.
And the idea that it leads to a reduction in crime rates is frequently brought up by proponents as well.
However, that same Reddit discussion dives right into the downsides for others. Someone else immediately responded, "My rent went up $500, directly countering that homeowner benefit."
Yeah, the renter experience is often very different. Another user criticized developers for creating, quote, low-effort bullshit areas where everything is overly expensive hipster shit that nobody of substance even wants to engage with. A bit harsh, maybe, but it captures a certain frustration.
Definitely captures a feeling. There's also the concern that gentrification doesn't actually solve crime, it just pushes it somewhere else.
Right. Someone argued it displaces and worsens that desperation elsewhere in the city or to another city, citing examples they saw in Cleveland or Philadelphia's Kensington neighborhood, where they felt addicts were just concentrated into one area.
And the practical impacts for those displaced are very real. New housing that gets built is often way out of reach, right? Built for much higher income brackets, not for the existing low to middle income residents.
Exactly. Plus, think about the commutes. Displaced poor people might now have to travel much further, often with less reliable transit, just to get to work. One user just put it very simply, the personal impact. You only have one home.
It's hard.
The debate even got into the roots of crime. One user stated, poverty literally is the cause of all street crime. People with better options don't risk prison for a quick buck. Which then led to this whole side discussion about whether more welfare or more policing is the answer, or if policing just moves the problem around.
Yeah, fundamental disagreements there. There was also a strong sentiment in the thread that newcomers should make an effort to join a community. Maybe consider yourself an outsider initially, rather than immediately trying to remake it in their own image.
Yeah, there was a really interesting and maybe uncomfortable example shared. A user mentioned trying to address dog waste in their neighborhood and getting a, quote, storm of replies accusing him of gentrifying the area and that policing dog shit is racist, classist, and ableist.
Wow.
It really highlights how even something that seems like a simple neighborhood improvement can be perceived as culturally insensitive or like policing existing residents' behavior, depending entirely on who's initiating the change and how it's done.
That's complex territory. And when it came to blame, views also diverged wildly. Some people said it's our system that's to blame, pointing fingers at capitalism or policy failures.
While others pointed towards a poverty mindset that is the problem, suggesting individual choices or cultural factors play a bigger role. So very different framings of the core issue.
And then there was that truly unpopular opinion that someone posted. Housing is a right, but living in a particular place is not a right.
Oof. Yeah, that one cuts deep.
It implies that while everyone deserves shelter, they don't necessarily have a right to stay in a specific neighborhood, especially if economic changes make it unaffordable for them. It really gets to the absolute core of the debate about who the city is for and what constitutes a fundamental right versus maybe a privilege.
It's a provocative thought, for sure.
Okay, so given all these complex, often conflicting perspectives and the real potential for harm, what can individuals actually do? If you're thinking of moving into a neighborhood that might be gentrifying, how can you do it in a way that minimizes harm and promotes, ethical engagement? The Eco B&B source offers some really practical steps you can take.
Yeah, it does. And the first step, maybe the most important, is to really try and understand the history before you arrive. You're not just moving into a building. You're joining a community with a specific story, often one involving systemic disinvestment or things like redlining in the past.
So how do you do that?
Research. Read local articles, go to the library, look for oral histories, maybe even take walking tours focused on the community's history. Understanding that context helps you grasp the potential impact of your presence.
So it's about being informed and respectful, right? Not just assuming you know best. And then the advice is to support local businesses, but specifically the existing ones, not just the fancy new places.
Exactly. Many small, long-standing businesses really struggle during gentrification. So the advice is direct your money consciously. Go to the existing laundromats, the local grocers, the family-run cafes, hire local contractors if you need work done. Support the businesses that have been the backbone of the community.
Okay. And what about connecting with people?
Building real relationships with the people already there is heavily emphasized. It doesn't have to be complicated. Simple things. Say hello to your neighbors, join a neighborhood cleanup day, maybe get involved in a community garden if there is one, attend town hall meetings.
And crucially,
Listen more than you speak. Learn from your neighbors, understand their priorities, respect their ways of life, even if they're different from yours.
This is where it gets really actionable, I think.
Mhm.
Actively try not to contribute to displacement pressure.
Yes, that means things like avoiding bidding wars when you're buying property, especially if you know you have a significant financial advantage over other potential buyers from the community.
Yeah.
It also means paying attention. If you see long-term tenants facing eviction or sudden huge rent hikes, maybe push back if you can. Support local tenant protection policies. Engage with housing justice groups working in the area. Don't be passive.
And if you're renovating your place.
Do it responsibly. Try to keep renovations generally in line with the existing neighborhood standards, rather than doing something super flashy that screams change for a different demographic. Use local contractors whenever possible. Prioritize necessary fixes over purely cosmetic upgrades that might signal a flip or attract speculators. And definitely don't pressure your landlord for luxury upgrades if that could trigger rent increases for others in the building.
Okay. Finally, it's about this idea of active ethical engagement. What does that look like?
The EcoB&B article suggests things like maybe choosing homes that don't seem to be under immediate financial pressure, perhaps properties that have been on the market for a while, rather than ones being fiercely contested or obviously flipped for quick profit. Avoid lobbying for changes that primarily benefit new arrivals without considering the impact on long-term residents. A common example is demanding increased police presence without understanding the local context or potential negative consequences for some community members.
Exactly.
Instead, join coalitions or community groups that already include long-term residents. Amplify their voices and support their priorities rather than trying to take the lead or impose your own agenda. And this is critical. Be open to criticism. You might make mistakes. Learn from them, listen, and adjust your approach.
It sounds like being a better neighbor in this context doesn't require perfection.
Not at all. Just accountability, humility, and a genuine commitment to supporting the community you're joining, rather than inadvertently changing it against its will or contributing to displacement.
Wow, what a deep dive this has been. Gentrification is clearly this incredibly powerful force of urban change. It brings investment, yes, that's undeniable, but it also carries the significant social costs: displacement, the loss of cultural identity, community fragmentation.
In The Right to the City, it offers this really profound framework for understanding and maybe resisting those negative impacts. It champions democratic participation, the right to belong, the idea that cities should serve people.
As you've heard today, opinions on gentrification are deeply personal, sometimes contradictory, incredibly varied. This topic really pushes us, I think, to question who our cities are actually for and how we even define progress.
Yeah, it's rarely a simple one-sided story. Understanding all those nuances, those different perspectives is absolutely key.
So what does this all mean for the future of our cities? Can we truly build urban spaces that manage to foster economic vibrancy and preserve historical character and ensure justice and belonging for all residents? Or are we just destined to keep shifting the problems around?
It raises that really important, maybe fundamental question. How do we balance the undeniable benefits that can come with urban improvement against the fundamental human right to community, to belonging, to stay put? How do we create cities that truly serve everyone?